He has worked specifically on the risks to human rights arising from the UK's post-Brexit legislative agenda, as well as what can be done to strengthen rights at the devolved level. He chairs the legislative options for the Working Group on Human Rights for the Welsh Government, and Charles is going to take us through where we are now. So please welcome Charles onto the stage.
So, good morning everyone, just about. And many thanks to WCIA for the invitation to speak today, and indeed to them and the Welsh Government for bringing us together today to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, as has just been said, my name is Charles Whitmore. I'm a researcher with Cardiff University's Wales Government Centre and WCBA, which is the national membership body for the voluntary sector in Wales. And my involvement in human rights started, for all my sins, from the rather grim prospect of exploring the potential human rights regressions as a result of the UK's withdrawal from the EU. Since then, though, I've had the much greater pleasure of being asked by the Welsh Government to chair the far more exciting work of working with academic and civil society colleagues to look at ways in which we can strengthen human rights in Wales. And I'll say a bit more about that shortly, because I've been asked today to look briefly, to look back and look forward on where we are in Wales and our human rights journey. So first, and while I can't mention every development here that warrants recognition, and the ministers have done a great job of that earlier anyway, I would like to paint a short, potted history of what I feel on a personal level. It's quite a proud human rights track record, though I appreciate that there are many experts in the room here today with far more personal experience than myself in bringing about and actually campaigning for these really significant achievements. So if we look back, human rights are built into the fabric of devolution in Wales. The European Convention on Human Rights features in the Government of Wales Act, which gives it a status and a role which is not replicated at the UK level. And indeed, there's some research which has found that human rights are historically portrayed in a more positive, particularly more positive frame in Wales when compared to some other parts of the UK. Wales was the first nation in 2011 with the Rights of Children and Young Persons Wales measure to indirectly incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, thus requiring ministers to have due regard to these rights in their decision making. Now, the impact of this and other developments actually go beyond Wales. Learning from this has informed and spurred on developments in Scotland, for example. We sometimes talk about a race to the top in human rights, at the devolved level at least, in the UK. The 2011 measure also set out a duty to promote knowledge and understanding of these rights, which, as we know, are crucial in the making of these rights accessible and impactful on people's lives. So in 2021, it was very welcome indeed when human rights were reflected in the new school curriculum. Again, in 2014, the Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act furthered this due regard approach, echoing the duty to have due regard to children's rights and also introducing due regard to the UN principles for older persons. Now, we haven't made quite as much progress on the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People yet, for example, amongst others, but due regard to that convention does feature in the Code of Praxis for that legislation. I have to also mention, of course, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. While not expressed in human rights language, I think in practice we're actually seeing some human rights underpinning its policy, and largely thanks to organisations like WCIA. For example, especially around the goal of a globally responsible Wales, we're seeing the international scene, human rights permeating Wales's international strategy. And of course, Wales being a nation of sanctuary is a huge part of this story as well. Now, moving forward, I think in light of the hardships that have been created by the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, we really need to think quite carefully about how we can also strengthen economic, social and cultural rights in Wales. We think of the right to housing, for example. These rights are core to improving people's lives and also how they experience many of their other human rights. So the commencement of the socio-economic duty was a step in the right direction on this front, and Olivier de Schutter, the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights for the UN, was recently praising Wales for this at a conference I was at in London. And indeed, Wales is also exploring the right to adequate housing. Now, there are many other actions that are being taken I could, or will be taken, I could mention the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan, the LGBTQ plus Action Plan, and I'll mention some other developments, some recent work in a short while. However, I have limited time and I really don't want to keep people away from their lunch longer than necessary. But it really is worth bearing in mind when reflecting on this progress that Wales as a nation has quite limited powers in the field of human rights compared, of course, to the UK level, or even Scotland, for example, because we don't have devolution of justice in Wales. Nevertheless, despite these limitations, Wales has progressively carved itself out a legal space to distinguish itself in the field of human rights. Now, despite these achievements, we still have a lot of work to do, and we need to acknowledge this. We can't lose sight of the severe international human rights crises that are occurring globally as we celebrate these 75 years of the UDHR. Neither can we lose sight of the UK context in which we find ourselves, and the fact that these last few years of progress in Wales have occurred in a context where we face some very real human rights tensions. Some would say, and I would agree in my view, regressions in human rights at the UK level. The Bill of Rights Bill, which was mentioned earlier and which we're grateful was withdrawn, sought to repeal and replace the Human Rights Act, which incidentally, I think we've got a year of anniversaries this year, is also celebrating an anniversary. It's 25 years. The Bill of Rights Bill sought to reduce access to justice and called into question the very universality of human rights, making these contingent on people's, air quote marks here, good behaviour. For example, as a sector across the UK, we were really worried that the means this bill was using to dismantle human rights might have been the start of a worrying trend, reflecting on recent developments. I'm worried that might be starting to look like it's the case. We now have the Illegal Migration Act, which United Nations experts have said is not in keeping with the UK's obligations under international human rights and refugee law. During its passage through Parliament, the UK government took the historic step of stating that it could not confirm that this legislation was compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. On this, and if you're following the news, you will have clocked this as well, but on this we can't ignore the UK government's policy to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. This feels very much at odds with Wales's commitment to being a nation of sanctuary, and has recently been held unlawful by the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom for being an unsafe policy. Now, this is an extremely live issue. The UK government said it was going to press ahead with the policy anyway, and I think just this week, I believe, signed a treaty with Rwanda in response to the Supreme Court. And only just yesterday evening, the UK government published the Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Bill, which made some very dubious reading for a number of us last night. When the UK government stated that with the Illegal Migration Act that it was unable to confirm compatibility with the European Convention, that felt remarkable. So to have the government state again in such a short span of time that it's unable to confirm that another bill is compatible with the UK's international human rights commitments feels absolutely shocking. The bill states, rather unnecessarily, that its validity is unaffected by international law. I won't list the specific international human rights treaties that are listed in the bill, in this definition of international law, because it also says, and I quote here, any other international law or convention or rule of international law whatsoever, including any judgment, decision or measure of the European Court of Human Rights. So it's extremely broad. The bill raises some very significant separation of powers and rule of law concerns because it directs courts, contrary to what the Supreme Court said about the safety of sending people to Rwanda, to consider Rwanda a safe place for these people, even in the face of facts to the contrary. And if that wasn't enough, it also instructs courts not to consider some claims. The bill disapplies the Human Rights Act, and it instructs courts to have no regard to interim measures handed down by the European Court of Human Rights. This is another significant legislative attack at the UK level on our human rights frameworks. And shockingly, arguments at the UK level are debating whether it goes far enough. So where are we in Wales on this? Well, organisations, academics, the Senedd, the Welsh Government have all been consistent in opposing and condemning these regressive trends at the UK level. In fact, travelling very much in the other direction, the Welsh Government, as was mentioned earlier, commissioned a significant piece of research to strengthening and advancing equality and human rights in Wales, which proposed, I think, around 40 wide-ranging recommendations from promoting public legal education of human rights to supporting and working with advocacy and advice services, all of which, entirely or partially, I believe, were accepted by the Welsh Government. There are also commitments in the programme of government to explore incorporation of UN conventions on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, so CEDAW, and the rights of disabled people, the UNCRDP. And indeed, the Welsh Government accepted recommendations in that research to explore options for primary Welsh legislation, a potential human rights Wales bill, to incorporate more sources of international human rights into Welsh law, and where possible, in a stronger form than due regard, so that these rights are enforceable by individuals before courts. Now, this work is extremely ambitious, and a group of us working under the Welsh Government's Human Rights Advisory Group are currently working with organisations like Disability When Wales, Type How, as well as academics from Swansea, Bangor and Cardiff University being involved. But I can't deny that our capacity for this work has been drained by this type of development constantly being thrown at us. Currently, we're in the early stages of going through on an article-by-article basis, on a right-by-right basis, trying to distill the essence of the right of individual human rights in these treaties, to identify what we can do within Wales to deliver against those rights, ideally looking where we can to deliver enforceable rights, and where that might not be possible because of competency issues, what we can do with what's at our disposal, education, guidance, commissioners, ombudsmen, what we can do to deliver these rights for people in their daily lives. We also welcome in the programme for government, of course, the government has focused on women's rights and disabled people's rights. In the work we're doing, I think personally, I'd also like to see us look at, and I'm hoping we will look at, older people's rights, children's rights, that we also consider the UN Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination in our work as well as LGBTQ+ rights. So as I alluded to earlier, I think we also need to really consider carefully and explore socioeconomic rights more. The right to adequate housing, food, health, these are crucial everyday rights that we increasingly need to protect given the economic and social challenges that we're now facing. Again, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights noted recently at an event that research had shown that for every £1 you invest in these rights, there's a £7 return in higher opportunity and productivity. Now, Scotland is moving towards incorporating the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, and I think we really need to push ourselves in Wales to explore how far we can go and what our options are on this front in Wales as well. And I think events and gatherings like today are a perfect opportunity for us to all work together towards this. So I'll end just before lunch by saying that amidst the significant challenges that we face globally, nationally, and at the devolved level, let's dream of a system of protection where people's everyday rights are delivered. And in those, hopefully, much rarer situations where they aren't, that people have the means, tools, knowledge, and allies to stand up for those rights. Many thanks again to WCAA and the Welsh Government for bringing us together today to mark this really monumental milestone. Thank you.